Saint Gregory the Great, who was Pope in the late 6th, early 7th century, dies in 604. So he would never have been dressed quite like this. It's a late medieval setup, right? He is full, papal regalia before the altar, kneeling, and above the altar or behind the altar, or it sort of depends. It changes a little bit from scene to scene, the way it's depicted. Covered in wounds, bloody. In this one, he's sort of standing on the altar, right where the chalice and the paten are, the bread and the wine, surrounded by in sort of proper like Dungeons and Dragons attributes of your player character with all of the instruments of his passion. The Pope saying Mass, Man of Sorrows, is standing in a box, right? So he's sort of represented as if rising from the grave already, which he's not. I mean, this is in no way meant to be a historical image, because it's not showing anything that ever actually happened to St. Gregory, even in story, or is it showing what actually happened at the resurrection? Representation of Christ as he looked after he was crucified, surrounded by the instruments that crucified.
The way you've described it, it sounds to me like there's some kind of time travel happening.
Okay. That wasn't what I was thinking, but go ahead.
No, I can't really explain it.
Well, so I mean, there's some kind of travel. There's portal happening here. A portal opened and something happened. Yeah, iconography was very popular. There's lots and lots of examples of it from the later Middle Ages. What's funny about the pictures is it's not necessarily clear that Gregory sees anything, right? In some of the images, like the first one, the painting I showed, he does seem to be looking at Christ, and Christ is showing the side wound and looking down at him. But in others, it's not necessarily clear that Gregory sees this array of vision of whatever it is. It's like, what is it, right? And in the Dur, I'll go back to the Dur, what's bizarre about it is they all look like physically modeled, as if Christ really is standing there on the altar in the box with all these. So it's a crazy image, because you're saying, is this stuff there? Is it real? Is Gregory meant to be seeing it? Is anybody who's with him? He's always accompanied by the full, array of deacons and altar boys and things like that. It's not necessarily clear that anybody else sees what's going on either.
It's an image they're not necessarily seeing, so it's not a hallucination, and it's not a vision necessarily, because they're not visualizing it. They can't see it necessarily. Correct. This is the time travel thing. I'm going to sound so woo-woo, but who cares?
Go for it.
It sounds like the depiction of parallel dimension, where you've got past and present overlapping in the same place.
There's definitely a sense of this interdimensionality, right? So this image that I'm showing now, a copy of the image that in fact is supposed to be the model for what Gregory sees over the altar, which is the Man of Sorrows. It's never meant to be historically a moment that the Gospels depict, right? There's no moment when the Gospels depict Christ dying or wounded, not on the cross, standing in his coffin. An icon that was known to be in Rome in the late Middle Ages. So that's why the Gregory Mass iconography is late Middle Ages. There's this icon brought to Rome from Constantinople. It's a mosaic, and it's known as the Man of Sorrows. The one I'm showing on the screen now is a copy of that. Apparently the original one that was brought from Constantinople is lost. What's interesting about this one is it's shown surrounded by other relics. So it's like Jesus dead in his coffin, but sitting upright, surrounded by lots of relics of all of the other saints. There are all this interdimensionality constantly in this representation of, well, what, right? What are we seeing? One argument that's often made, and the article that I showed you to help us think about this was by my dissertation advisor, my teacher, Caroline Bynum, where she's talking about, it's like usually what people in the scholarship argue about what's going on in this iconography is it's showing the true transubstantiation. It's trying to show the reality of what, by the later Middle Ages, in Catholic teaching, Western Latin teaching, is said to happen in the Mass, which is that when the priest says the words of consecration over the bread and the wine, they are transubstantiated, in the fancy Aristotelian term, into the flesh and blood of Christ. And then there's huge debates throughout the Middle Ages about exactly what that means, right? Is it historically his flesh and blood? Is it mystically his flesh and blood, but it's somehow real flesh and blood? So there's some kind of real transformation here, right? And of course, in the Protestant critique of all of this by the 16th century, as the urban legend about Protestant critiques goes, it's the hocus pocus. It's the hocus corpus,
yes,
which is the hocus pocus magic spell. Here we've got magic, bread and wine that's now magically the body and blood of Christ, magically proven in this iconography to be there on the altar. Ooh, isn't that gross?
So this is when they're saying, connected to the reports of Eucharists becoming bloody flesh. Is this why the Protestants are accusing Catholics of performing magic? Because of these proof miracles that they had. Priests in particular parishes were presenting transubstantiated Eucharist. So, I mean, it could look very voodoo to people from the outside.
This is kind of voodoo-like, right? That's why in my original plan for this discussion, which is going to shatter into a billion different rainbows as we talk through with all of these problems, that I was saying, it's like this juxtaposed with the Aztec heart thing. Sure, right? It's supposed to be real flesh and blood, and here he is really bleeding. And what you're referring to is what Caroline, she went on to do a full book on these blood miracles, these bloody host miracles, called the book is called Wonderful Blood. And yes, in the later Middle Ages, there are shrines that are said to have these hosts that miraculously were seen to bleed. One is at Wilsnack, that's all I remember. And there are a number of them in Germany, which is where those miracles were quite popular. And certainly from a modern perspective, or from a Protestant perspective, that looks like you're doing like magic in the usual fantasy world sense of you've said words and matter transforms. Abracadabra, yeah.
Yeah, which would be, if I put Protestant hat on, would be my first critique of what Catholics are doing in the Mass and what we're doing when we're claiming that the Eucharist is flesh and blood of Christ. All right, so we have a big problem because so we've got something that looks like voodoo. How then do we defend the Mass as not being just another kind of human sacrifice? It's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. And that's why we got distracted last time with all the Girardian doubling and scapegoat and things like that. This is why I put them together, because it's saying the Mass has been criticized within Christianity for centuries now as being nothing more than myth, like as pagan or as magical, as those heathen myths that we're supposed to reject about the Norse gods or the Aztec gods or anybody else's gods. Isn't, as you're saying, isn't this just voodoo or magic of an ordinary diabolical sort?
That's what it seems like to describe a blood hose. From the perspective of an outsider, a non-catechized Orthodox or Catholic, to explain this process to somebody, it would be like saying, okay, we're animating a fetish. We're animating something, essentially idolizing bread and then animating it through magic.
In fact, exactly, right? It's like you've spoken words over the matter, and the spell works, and because it's magic, it transforms the matter. We're sitting on this really, really hard, guys, so that you realize that we know the problem. The world of the internet, which is disembodied and discarnate, it seems to be alleged that like nobody understands that this is probably something that people were concerned about in the past. Oh, don't you know how, you guys are just doing magic. We don't think that's what it is. But it takes some work. Caroline, when she looked at these pictures and she said, okay, that in the art history has seemed to be the problem, that they're sort of trying to show something real, like what is actually being transformed in the Mass and what. Her argument, though, is that it isn't about transubstantiation. This particular iconography, the Mass of Saint Gregory, is not, in fact, about the zombie problem. Okay. Oh dear. It's like, wait a minute, we just set you all up to say aha, but no, it's not. Woof. Pull the rug out from under you there. Sometimes I feel like we as scholars can make too fine of distinctions. I think it can be that, probably, because understanding what it means to say in this ritual, we have access in our time travel back to the moment when Christ is historically crucified. I mean, there is a time travel element to it. I think you were right in thinking that. There is a kind of saying that we want to be witnesses to the crucifixion. And we are potentially witnesses to the crucifixion at the Mass because it is being done in remembrance of Christ and in remembrance of his suffering. It is time travel and also something else.
It's time travel in the sense that when Christ instituted the Eucharist, the Last Supper, he said, as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. He didn't say, this will be my body and this will be my blood. He said, this is. Just that phrasing alone makes me think, okay, so this is present continuous. It's not I know this sounds very woo-woo.
You really need to stop apologizing for that. We're going woo-woo tonight.
We are going woo-woo.
You got your dress on. I'm
in Africa. Why Anglos?
Some in the chat insisting on the African whiteness. Silent Draco? you be silent. No, he says kilts, dear. At the time, the saints from Africa and Middle East were definitely considered white. Well, they're definitely considered Roman. You know, Augustine and company
It's not
were.
the same
but
thing.
Yeah, we would differ on that, whether it's the same or...
It's not the same thing, because why did white Australia then classify Southern Italians as non-white?
Well, we're time traveling across different empires.
I'm not speaking like an American. I'm using my own country's way of describing these things, specifically so I can contrast it with what you guys are all doing up there in North America.
You're in a totally different, southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere. Like, we get to flip the world.
We're in the antipodes.
You guys do realize she's in the future right now. She knows what she's talking about. She's been here already. We're yesterday.
See, we are time traveling now. We've got a good indication of what's going on in the Mass of Saint Gregory just by you and I having this conversation in 2 frames, right? But we're not at the same time.
But we're not. Okay, so you were talking about the Mass is a presence. It's a continuing presence in the historical world, in Anno Domini. Right, so it's not eternal. It's actually in time, not out of time. But that we are somehow, and the Mass, seen into something else, that other thing that we see into. Now with the altarpiece, with the mosaic Man of Sorrows surrounded by the relics. Altarpieces are meant to show something of the mystery that's happening in the Mass. And it is interesting. I've now been going to St. John Cantius for a full year, and I'll say, face the altar, guys. I really, really understand why the traditional Latin Mass people prefer the traditional Latin Mass. One, because there is a precision and an elegance. One of my friends I took with me to Mass, and he said, it's kind of mathematical in the precision and economy of the movements of the priest and the servers at the altar. It matters that they face the altar. They face whatever's the altarpiece is trying to depict. And we watch them and witness with them and support them in their standing before whatever it is that we're standing before when we are offering that, making that offer. And here with this big reliquary altarpiece with the Man of Sorrows, it's showing you something of where you are when you're at the Mass. The saints are all not here. Their bodies are here. But where are they? So how do you think, so we recognize that modern people in our particular media environment have difficulty with these mysteries. We've acknowledged that from the outside they look a bit strange and could look like voodoo or witchcraft or Aztec human sacrifice. How should we help them get to the place that they can see what we see?
Facing the altar. So I'm thinking of this because we do. In the Coptic tradition, we do this. The liturgy is all about facing the iconostasis behind the altar, the area where we have the big icons of the Lord. So usually what you'll see in a Coptic church, inside the little altar nave, it usually has a curtain across. The curtain is open for the liturgy. So we have a revealing that happens during that liturgy that is not present at any other moment. The curtain is closed, and then once Abuna, the priest, comes in to formally start the liturgy, the curtain is open, which is recording the temple imagery of what the Lord has done for us, rending the curtain open. Suddenly we're seeing something inside. So we go into the Holy of Holies, and then we're looking, the altar is there, and behind is usually very, very large icon of the Lord, but fully very, very big. Ratio no longer exists in the same way. You know, suddenly the temporal rules no longer apply. Spatial and temporal rules are changed. As soon as that curtain is open, our priest will face the altar for the majority of the liturgy. He will look maybe 2 or 3 times at the congregation during the service, but that's it. For the rest of the time, he faces Christ. He faces Christ at the altar. So I think that's probably the thing that I would start off with. We have this revealing that happens during that liturgy. Something is going on there that is not happening at any other moment.
So the thing is, I'm totally with you. I see all of that as you're describing it. The veil is drawn back. You go into the Holy of Holies. There's something else that you're seeing. But my guess is a lot of people are going to be they're going to be looking at those Mass of Saint Gregory images and simply seeing a magic trick.